Forget what you think you know about history. What if the Hohenstaufens, those tragic emperors, were never truly gone? This isn't a fantasy, but a thought experiment exploring the mind-bending reality of their return. Get ready to witness a world turned upside down as the past reclaims the present. Imagine a world where power, pride, and destiny intertwine so tightly that a single misstep changes the course of continents. In the heart of medieval Europe, a name once carried the weight of empires and dreams, the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Their story is one of brilliance and ruin, of visionaries who sought to rule from the Alps to Jerusalem, and of a line whose end came not with a final victory, but with the silence of exile and death. They were not just emperors. They were symbols of the struggle between divine authority and earthly power, between the crown and the church, between the dream of unity and the harshness of reality. The tale of the Hohenstaufens is a tapestry woven with courage, faith, betrayal, and loss, a reminder that even the mightiest can vanish when ambition outpaces endurance. The Hohenstaufens rose from the rugged lands of Swabia, a region in what is now southwestern Germany. They were not born emperors. They began as noble lords, loyal to their rulers, skilled in war and politics, and gifted in the art of survival. Their name came from the castle of Staufen, perched high upon a hill, a symbol of both strength and aspiration. In the 12th century, as the Holy Roman Empire struggled with the chaos of rival claims and church interference, the Hohenstaufens emerged as a family capable of restoring order. Their ascent was driven by intelligence, charm, and the force of personality that defined every great ruler of the medieval age. At the center of their rise stood Frederick I, remembered by history as Frederick Barbarossa. His red beard became as legendary as his ambition. He sought to revive the Roman ideal of empire, to bring harmony between Germany and Italy, and to assert the emperor's authority over the turbulent princes and city-states that challenged him. Barbarossa was no mere conqueror. He was a man of vision who understood that the empire could not survive on sword alone. He reformed the laws, strengthened the administration, and tried to unify a realm that had long been fragmented by feuds. His reign was an age of movement, of knights riding to Italy, of popes and emperors clashing over power, and of dreams that reached beyond the Alps. Yet even the most formidable of rulers cannot escape fate. The tension between the emperor and the papacy haunted Barbarossa's reign. The church saw the empire as both a partner and a rival, and each pope sought to limit imperial influence in Italy. Barbarossa's efforts to dominate the Italian cities met fierce resistance, especially from the Lombard League, a coalition of independent communes that refused to bow to imperial rule. The wars dragged on for decades, leaving destruction and resentment in their wake. Despite his military prowess, Barbarossa eventually had to compromise. He accepted the independence of the Italian cities, a bitter concession for a man who dreamed of a united empire. His final act came during the Third Crusade, when he led his forces toward the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. He drowned while crossing a river in Asia Minor, a death that shocked Christendom. Many refused to believe he was gone, and legends spread that he merely slept beneath a mountain, waiting to return when Germany needed him most. That myth would survive for centuries, symbolizing the hope of lost greatness. After Barbarossa's death, the Hohenstaufen dynasty continued its struggle for dominance through his son, Henry VI, and his grandson, Frederick II. Henry married Constance of Sicily, linking the German Empire with the wealthy and strategic kingdom of southern Italy. It was a bold move, for it brought the Hohenstaufens into direct conflict with the papacy once again. The popes feared encirclement, trapped between the Hohenstaufen lands to the north and their new possessions to the south. When Henry died young, his son Frederick II inherited both crowns, a child destined to rule, but also to fight for survival from the moment he was born. Frederick II became one of the most fascinating figures of the Middle Ages. Known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, he was a man of contradictions, an emperor, a scholar, a linguist, a warrior, and a skeptic. He spoke several languages, studied science and philosophy, and surrounded himself with Muslim scholars in his Sicilian court. He promoted learning and tolerance in an age often ruled by superstition. Yet his brilliance made him enemies. The popes regarded him as dangerous, too independent, too modern for their liking. To them, he was a threat not only to their political power, but to the spiritual order itself. The papacy denounced him as the Antichrist, while his admirers saw in him the last true emperor who tried to reconcile faith with reason and empire with enlightenment. Frederick's reign was a long battle to preserve what his family had built. He fought rebellions in Germany, revolts in Italy, and endless conflicts with the papacy. He even led a crusade to the Holy Land, but rather than fighting, he negotiated a peaceful return of Jerusalem through diplomacy, a move that shocked Europe but demonstrated his pragmatism. His ability to achieve through negotiation what others sought through bloodshed revealed a mind far ahead of his time. However, peace did not last. The Church excommunicated him repeatedly, and wars drained his resources. By the time of his death in the mid-13th century, the empire was fractured, the loyalty of his nobles uncertain, and his heirs surrounded by enemies. The decline of the Hohenstaufens after Frederick II's death was swift and merciless. His sons and grandsons tried to hold the empire together, but the forces arrayed against them were overwhelming. The papacy supported rival claimants, sowing division within the German states. The French monarchy, eager to expand its influence in Italy, also opposed them. Frederick's son Conrad IV died young, leaving his illegitimate brother, Manfred, to defend the family's legacy in Sicily. Manfred was courageous and charismatic, beloved by his people but despised by the Church. His rule ended in tragedy when Charles of Anjou, backed by the Pope, invaded Italy and defeated him in battle. Manfred's death was a symbolic moment, the sun setting on a dynasty that had once aspired to unite Europe under one crown. Conradin, the last male heir of the Hohenstaufens, a youth barely 16 years old when he tried to reclaim his inheritance. He gathered an army of loyal supporters and marched into Italy to challenge Charles of Anjou. For a moment, it seemed as if the spirit of the Hohenstaufens would rise again, but destiny was cruel. Conradin's forces were defeated near Naples, and he was captured. In a scene that shocked Europe, the young prince was executed publicly, his head severed as a warning to all who might dream of restoring the old empire. With his death, the line of the Hohenstaufens ended, and a great silence settled over the empire. The papacy had triumphed, but at the cost of destroying the only dynasty that had ever come close to uniting the German and Italian worlds. The fall of the Hohenstaufens created a void that lasted for generations. Without their leadership, the Holy Roman Empire descended into political fragmentation. Princes and electors gained power at the expense of the crown, and Germany became a patchwork of small states, each jealously guarding its independence. Italy, too, remained divided, its cities ruled by rival factions and foreign powers. The dream of a unified empire faded, replaced by centuries of division and conflict. Yet the memory of the Hohenstaufens did not disappear. Their story became a legend, a reminder of what might have been, a Europe united by law and culture rather than by conquest and fear. The legacy of the Hohenstaufens can be seen not only in the ruins of their castles or the chronicles of their battles, but in the ideas they left behind. They represented a bridge between the medieval and the modern worlds. Under their rule, art, architecture, and learning flourished. The imperial court of Frederick II was a center of culture and scholarship, attracting poets, scientists, and philosophers from across the Mediterranean. He encouraged translations of ancient Greek and Arabic texts into Latin, helping to preserve the knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance. In Sicily, his administration introduced reforms that laid the groundwork for modern governance. He codified laws, standardized taxation, and sought justice over feudal privilege. His policies reflected a belief in rational order and the rule of law, ideals that would influence European thought long after his death. But the Hohenstaufens also left behind a warning. Their downfall revealed the limits of power in a divided world. They tried to control an empire too vast, too diverse, and too unstable to be ruled by one hand. Their conflicts with the papacy exposed the deep tension between spiritual and temporal authority, a struggle that would define European politics for centuries. Their story showed that greatness alone cannot overcome the forces of time and human frailty. Every empire, no matter how mighty, is vulnerable to the same cycles of ambition and decay. Even in their absence, the memory of the Hohenstaufens shaped later generations. Romantic poets, chroniclers, and nationalists looked back on their reign with longing. In the 19th century, as Germany sought unity, the figure of Frederick Barbarossa reappeared as a national symbol. Tales spread that he still slept beneath a mountain, his beard grown long, waiting for the day when Germany would be whole again. This myth gave comfort during times of division, suggesting that the lost emperors had not vanished completely but lingered in the collective memory of the people. The idea of a sleeping emperor captured the essence of their legacy, a blend of history and hope, power and tragedy. The Hohenstaufen name became a mirror through which Europe reflected on its own contradictions. They embodied both the glory of empire and the price of ambition. They built cathedrals and waged wars, patronized poets and defied popes, dreamed of peace but lived amid endless conflict. Their vision of unity was noble, yet it demanded a level of authority that medieval Europe could not sustain. In trying to bridge heaven and earth, they fell into the abyss between them. Their empire was both a masterpiece and a warning, a story that reminds us that human greatness is never permanent. The ruins of their castles still dot the German hills, silent witnesses to an age of grandeur. In Italy, the castles of Frederick II stand as testaments to his intellect and his sense of beauty. Castel del Monte, with its perfect geometry and mysterious symbolism, remains one of the most striking monuments of medieval architecture. Its octagonal design reflects his fascination with harmony and proportion, blending science, art, and mysticism. These stones speak more eloquently than any chronicler of the emperor's mind, a mind that sought to find order in a chaotic world. When one looks at the history of Europe after the Hohenstaufens, their absence becomes even more striking. The Holy Roman Empire survived in name, but its spirit had changed. No ruler after them would ever command the same mixture of fear, admiration, and loyalty. The balance of power shifted toward local princes and foreign monarchies. The dream of an empire stretching from the North Sea to Sicily faded, replaced by the slow rise of nation-states. The papacy, having triumphed over the Hohenstaufens, found itself entangled in its own decline in later centuries. The victory over the emperors turned out to be hollow, for the unity they destroyed was never replaced. The story of the Hohenstaufens is not just a tale of medieval politics, but a reflection on human nature itself. It shows how ambition, however noble, can become destructive when it overreaches. It reveals how ideals can clash with reality, how visionaries can become outcasts, and how the pursuit of greatness often leads to isolation. Yet it also celebrates courage, intelligence, and the enduring desire to create something larger than oneself. The Hohenstaufens may have lost their crowns, their lands, and their lives, but they left behind a legacy that transcends defeat. They showed that even in loss there can be meaning, that the ruins of an empire can still inspire, and that history remembers those who dared to dream. The lost emperors live on not in power, but in memory. Their story is written in the stones of their castles, the pages of their laws, and the myths that refuse to die. In every age, people have looked back to them as symbols of a world that once believed in greatness, in the possibility of unity, and in the dignity of rule guided by intellect. They remind us that history is not merely a record of triumphs, but a chronicle of struggles, failures, and the enduring human spirit. The Hohenstaufens rose from the hills of Swabia to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire and fell into the darkness of extinction, yet their light continues to flicker across time. They were emperors who dreamed too greatly, and though they were lost, their legacy endures in the heart of every age that dares to remember them. If the Hohenstaufens had not fallen, if fate had bent slightly in their favor, the course of Europe might have been transformed beyond recognition. History often turns on moments so brief and fragile that they are nearly invisible. A death in a river, a battle lost at dusk, a sword raised a second too late. In the story of the Hohenstaufens, those moments came again and again. The drowning of Frederick Barbarossa, the untimely death of Henry, the youth of Conradin, the betrayals of allies who could not see beyond their own borders. Each one tilted the balance toward decline. But what if one of those moments had gone differently? What if Frederick II had lived long enough to secure his succession firmly? Or if his grandson Conradin had triumphed in Italy instead of being led to his execution? The possibilities reach far beyond dynastic politics. They stretch into the shaping of nations, the role of the Church, the birth of the Renaissance, and even the entire structure of European identity. To imagine a world where the Hohenstaufens endured is to imagine a Europe more unified, more centralized, and perhaps more enlightened centuries earlier. The Holy Roman Empire, in its real history, was a loose confederation of territories, a mosaic of princes and bishops bound together by little more than tradition. The emperor's authority was symbolic, constantly challenged by nobles who valued independence above loyalty. But under the Hohenstaufens, especially Frederick II, the empire had shown flashes of what it could become, a coherent state built on law, administration, and reason rather than on feudal allegiance. Had Frederick succeeded in establishing his vision permanently, His descendants could have transformed the empire into a powerful, centralized monarchy long before the modern age. The endless feudal fragmentation that weakened Germany for centuries might never have taken root. Imagine, for instance, that Frederick II had managed to secure his heir's position firmly before his death. His sons would have inherited not a fractured dominion, but a functioning imperial system supported by loyal administrators rather than rebellious vassals. He had already begun this process in Sicily, where he built an efficient bureaucracy staffed by trained officials instead of hereditary lords. If that model had spread northward, the empire could have evolved into a true kingdom in the modern sense, a single state governed by laws, with a central treasury, standing army, and unified courts. Instead of the endless wars between princes that later tore Germany apart, there might have been stability under imperial oversight. The Holy Roman Empire could have become, not a medieval relic, but a forerunner of the nation-states that later emerged in France and England. The ripple effects of such a transformation would have been immense. A strong and centralized German kingdom in the 13th century would have altered the entire balance of power in Europe. France, which grew into the dominant continental power in the late Middle Ages, might have faced a rival equal in strength and organization centuries earlier. The long series of wars that later defined Western Europe, the Hundred Years' War, the struggles for Italy, and even the Reformation conflicts, might have taken completely different forms or been avoided altogether. A unified empire stretching from the North Sea to Sicily would have been a formidable counterweight to both France and the papacy. Its resources, population, and geography would have made it the heart of Europe in a far more literal sense. This scenario also changes the story of Italy. The Hohenstaufens saw Italy not as a distant province, but as the keystone of their realm. Sicily, under Frederick II, was a laboratory of governance, law, and culture. If his descendants had maintained control, southern Italy could have continued as a beacon of intellectual progress. The universities he founded might have become centers of European learning centuries before the rise of Florence and Venice. The Renaissance, which emerged in the city-states of a fragmented Italy, might instead have been nurtured within a united and stable empire. Scholars and artists who later sought refuge from political chaos in independent courts could have found patronage under a single imperial system that valued both faith and reason. The papacy's role in this alternate world would have been profoundly different. The endless struggle between popes and emperors defined the real Middle Ages, shaping the politics and theology of Europe for centuries. If the Hohenstaufens had prevailed, that struggle might have ended not with the subjugation of the empire, as it did historically, but with the containment of the papacy's temporal ambitions. The Church would still have held spiritual authority, but its direct involvement in political power could have been sharply limited. Instead of excommunicating emperors and raising armies, popes might have been forced to return fully to their pastoral and religious roles. This shift would have reduced the destructive wars that ravaged Italy and might even have lessened the later calls for reform that eventually fractured the Church during the Reformation. A Hohenstaufen victory could have brought a different kind of religious order, one that blended imperial stability with intellectual freedom. Frederick II's reign demonstrated that faith and reason did not have to be enemies. His curiosity about science, nature, and philosophy coexisted with his belief in divine order, though the Church saw him as dangerous for precisely that reason. If his worldview had triumphed, the tension between religious orthodoxy and scientific inquiry might have softened centuries earlier. Europe could have entered its intellectual awakening long before the 15th century. The progress that came with the Renaissance might have begun in the 13th, under imperial protection rather than in defiance of religious authority. Yet the greatest question remains: could such an empire have lasted? Even with strong leadership, the challenges of ruling such a vast and diverse territory were enormous. The Hohenstaufens would have had to balance the independence of the German princes with the ambitions of the Italian cities, the loyalty of the Church with the demands of the crown, and the constant pressure from external powers such as France, Hungary, and the Byzantine remnants. Success would have required not only power but adaptability. But if any dynasty could have managed it, it was theirs. Frederick II's blend of intellect, tolerance, and pragmatism showed a political sophistication rare for his age. His successors might have built upon those foundations, creating an imperial federation that respected local traditions while maintaining central authority. A lasting Hohenstaufen empire would also have changed the economic landscape of Europe. The Mediterranean trade routes that enriched Venice and Genoa could have been controlled directly by the imperial administration through Sicily and southern Italy. This would have brought immense wealth to the empire, allowing investment in infrastructure, art, and education on a scale unseen in the medieval world. The rise of the great Italian banking families might have been curtailed or redirected into imperial service. The commercial centers of Germany, such as Nuremberg and Augsburg, could have flourished even earlier, linking northern and southern Europe under one economic system. Such prosperity would have reshaped society. The growth of towns and trade under imperial protection might have weakened the rigid feudal system much sooner. A middle class of merchants, scholars, and artisans could have emerged centuries before it did historically. This social shift would have laid the groundwork for a more modern Europe, where individual talent and education mattered as much as noble birth. The empire could have become a cradle of civic rights and intellectual exchange, blending German order with Italian creativity, and creating a cultural unity that Europe never truly achieved in reality. But power, even in the most ideal hands, never exists without its shadows. A strong Hohenstaufen empire would have faced constant resistance from those who feared centralization. The independent princes of Germany, who in real history enjoyed near-sovereign powers, would have fought bitterly to retain their privileges. Some might have aligned with foreign powers or the papacy to weaken imperial control. Rebellions could have erupted in regions unwilling to yield their autonomy. Yet unlike in reality, where such conflicts broke the empire apart, in this alternate history a centralized army and administrative network might have kept them contained. The cost would have been high, perhaps even the creation of an authoritarian structure that valued order above liberty. Europe might have been unified, but at the expense of the diversity that later gave birth to its vibrant cultural mosaic. Still, even such a centralized empire might not have remained static. Over time, its internal strength could have evolved into a constitutional monarchy or even an early form of federation. The Hohenstaufens were not blind to the importance of law and justice. They saw governance as a contract between ruler and realm. The legal codes of Frederick II already reflected ideas of accountability and due process. With time, those principles could have expanded into broader forms of representation. A parliament of princes and towns might have emerged under imperial guidance, balancing authority with consultation. In this sense, a surviving Hohenstaufen empire could have anticipated modern constitutionalism centuries before its time. The papacy's loss of temporal power in this scenario would have had lasting spiritual consequences. Without the constant distraction of political intrigue, the Church might have turned its attention inward, focusing on theology, education, and missionary work. The universities founded under papal influence could have developed in closer partnership with imperial institutions, fostering a more cooperative relationship between faith and reason. The bitter divisions that later fueled the Reformation might have been prevented, or at least softened, by a culture of dialogue rather than confrontation. The unity of Western Christendom could have endured, strengthened by a balance of power that respected both spiritual and secular authority. The cultural ripple of such a world would be immense. If the Renaissance had bloomed under imperial patronage rather than within the fragmented city-states, its character would have been different. Instead of rival courts competing for artists and architects, there might have been coordinated efforts to promote learning across the empire. The art of the period could have reflected a sense of unity and harmony rather than the fierce individualism of real history. The architecture of the imperial cities might have combined northern solidity with southern grace, symbolizing a union of cultures rather than their division. Science and philosophy, nurtured under imperial protection, might have advanced without the centuries of suspicion that later accompanied them. The question of colonial expansion also arises. A strong, unified Holy Roman Empire could have turned outward earlier than the fragmented powers of real history. With access to the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the resources of Central Europe, the empire might have embarked on exploration long before Portugal and Spain began their voyages. The discovery of new lands could have occurred under imperial banners rather than those of rival kingdoms. Such early expansion would have shifted global power structures profoundly, perhaps leading to a more balanced distribution of influence rather than the later dominance of Western Europe's coastal nations. Another possibility concerns the nature of warfare and diplomacy. A strong empire would have reduced the constant interstate conflicts that characterized later medieval Europe. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, for example, might never have occurred if both nations had faced a unified and stable empire to the east and south. The existence of a dominant continental power would have encouraged diplomacy and alliances over endless wars. The military innovations that emerged from these conflicts might have developed differently, with imperial armies focusing on organization and technology rather than sheer destruction. This could have led to an earlier professionalization of warfare, reducing the devastation that shaped so much of medieval and early modern Europe. The intellectual consequences of a surviving Hohenstaufen dynasty are equally intriguing. Frederick II's interest in science and philosophy was centuries ahead of its time. He sponsored studies in astronomy, medicine, and natural history, defying the notion that knowledge should be confined to theology. His successors, had they continued this tradition, might have established a network of imperial academies and universities. The scientific revolution could have begun much earlier, built on steady institutional support rather than on isolated bursts of discovery. The fusion of Arabic, Greek, and Latin knowledge in the imperial court might have produced an intellectual environment more open and dynamic than anything Europe actually experienced until the 17th century. Even the language of Europe might have evolved differently. The empire's administrative reach would have encouraged linguistic standardization, perhaps uniting the German dialects into a common written form centuries before Luther's translation of the Bible. Latin might have remained the universal language of scholarship, but a standardized German tongue could have become the language of government and culture. This linguistic unity would have strengthened the sense of shared identity across the empire, linking north and south in ways that the later patchwork of dialects and regional identities never achieved. Of course, no vision of an alternate past can be free of its own flaws. The very power that could have unified Europe under the Hohenstaufens might also have stifled its creativity. The fragmentation of real history, painful as it was, gave rise to competition between cities, kingdoms, and ideas that fueled innovation. Without that rivalry, progress might have slowed. A single imperial system might have valued stability over experimentation, conformity over diversity. The Renaissance, under imperial control, might have been more orderly but less daring. The Reformation might never have occurred, but neither would the explosion of thought that followed it. The Europe that emerged might have been more peaceful, but less passionate, its culture unified but its spirit restrained. Still, the thought lingers. A world where the lost emperors never fell would have been a world less torn by war and division. The idea of Europe as a single civilization, bound by law, culture, and shared purpose, might have taken root earlier and more deeply. The centuries of rivalry that followed their fall, the wars of religion, the national conflicts, the shifting alliances, might have been replaced by a steady evolution toward unity. The map of modern Europe would be unrecognizable. The Holy Roman Empire might have evolved into the heart of a continental federation, stretching from the Baltic to Sicily, from the Rhine to the Adriatic, governing through councils and law rather than through fragmented monarchies. The papacy, free from its worldly struggles, might have become a moral rather than political authority. The Renaissance might have emerged under imperial guidance, blending faith and reason instead of setting them against each other. The Reformation might have been unnecessary. The Enlightenment might have arrived early, nourished by centuries of stability rather than rebellion. The Industrial Revolution, born of unified trade and education systems, might have transformed the world sooner. In such a world, Europe's long road to unity, marked by blood and division, could have begun and ended with the Hohenstaufens. The thought of it carries both wonder and melancholy. For all the potential of that unrealized future, the true legacy of the Hohenstaufens lies not only in what they might have achieved, but in what their fall revealed. Their story remains a mirror of history's fragility, a lesson that greatness can vanish in an instant, but that its echo can endure for centuries. Even in defeat, they shaped the imagination of Europe. The empire they dreamed of never returned, but the idea of it, the vision of unity, law, and enlightenment, continued to haunt the continent. And perhaps that is the truest measure of their power, that long after their castles fell to ruin and their bloodline ended, the world still wonders what might have been if the lost emperors had never fallen. If the world that emerged from the survival of the Hohenstaufen dynasty had continued unbroken into modern times, the face of Europe, and perhaps the planet itself, would bear little resemblance to what we know today. The empire that once dreamed of unity, law, and enlightenment would have matured through centuries of evolution into a state unlike any other. A fusion of tradition and progress, intellect and discipline, order and creativity. The dynasty that began amid feudal conflict would have transformed into a modern power shaped by reason and guided by continuity, and the Europe that followed their vision would have been forged not in revolution and nationalism, but in gradual, consistent development. The question then becomes, in a world where the Hohenstaufens endured, where would that empire stand in the 21st century, and how would its ancient values express themselves in a modern context? To picture this alternate world, one must imagine a Europe that never fractured into competing nation-states. The empire that had stretched from the northern forests of Germany to the sunlit plains of Sicily would have remained intact. Its heart centered in the same lands where Frederick Barbarossa once rode to war and Frederick II once ruled from his Sicilian courts. Over time, the rigid hierarchies of medieval governance would have given way to constitutional development, balancing imperial authority with representation from regions and cities. What emerged would not be an absolute monarchy, but a federated empire, bound by law, language, and shared purpose. Instead of Germany and Italy developing as separate nations, they would have remained integral provinces of a greater imperial system. The Holy Roman Empire, under continuous Hohenstaufen rule, could have evolved into a constitutional federation spanning Central and Southern Europe, perhaps extending its influence into neighboring regions through diplomacy rather than conquest. In such a world, the idea of national rivalry, the endless conflicts between Germany and France, the competing identities that shaped the 19th and 20th centuries, might never have taken root. The unity imposed by centuries of Hohenstaufen rule would have made nationalism unnecessary, replaced by a broader sense of imperial citizenship. The empire would have offered a shared identity built not on ethnicity, but on law and heritage. That alone would have prevented much of the bloodshed that stained real European history. The world wars that in reality devastated the continent might never have occurred. Without the forces of fragmentation and nationalism that arose after the fall of the empire, there would have been no need for the unification struggles of the 19th century or the nationalist movements that later exploded into global conflict. Europe under the Hohenstaufens would have grown into a single political and cultural entity, commanding enormous influence across the world. By the 21st century, such an empire would likely occupy the place that both the European Union and modern Germany now share, but with far greater cohesion and authority. Its capital might have been an evolved version of one of its ancient centers. Perhaps Aachen, the seat of the old emperors, or Palermo, where the Mediterranean world once met the northern kingdoms. The empire's institutions would blend the ceremonial weight of monarchy with the practical efficiency of a parliamentary federation. A council of provinces might manage internal affairs, while the emperor served as both symbol and arbiter of unity. This system would have developed over centuries, absorbing the lessons of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the digital age without ever breaking the thread of imperial continuity. In the global landscape of the 21st century, such an empire would stand as one of the dominant powers, equal to or surpassing any existing nation. Its population would encompass the heart of Europe, its economy built on centuries of coordinated infrastructure, scientific innovation, and trade. The balance between industry and culture, inherited from the intellectual ideals of Frederick II, would make it not only wealthy, but deeply advanced in the arts and sciences. Unlike the fragmented states of our real world, the Hohenstaufen Empire would have approached modernization through long-term planning and steady reform rather than through abrupt revolutions. The result would be a society both stable and dynamic, where tradition coexisted with technology and where the lessons of 1,000 years guided the decisions of the present. Culturally, the continuation of Hohenstaufen patronage would have shaped a Europe whose architecture, art, and literature expressed a distinct imperial style, one that blended the Gothic heritage of Germany, the classical influences of Italy, and the rational symmetry of the Renaissance that their own dynasty might have inspired. The empire's cities would reflect this heritage in their design. Cathedrals that fused medieval craftsmanship with modern engineering, public squares that echoed ancient forums, and government buildings that symbolized balance between power and enlightenment. Every stone, every spire, every archway would carry the mark of a civilization that had never broken its connection with its past. Modern skyscrapers would rise beside restored castles, harmonizing rather than competing, and the empire's architects would approach construction as both art and moral statement. a continuation of the Hohenstaufen belief that beauty and order were reflections of divine reason. Art itself would occupy a different place in such a society. The Hohenstaufens had been patrons of poets, scholars, and scientists. They had seen knowledge as the foundation of good governance. Their successors would have continued that tradition, sponsoring universities, research institutes, and cultural academies throughout the centuries. The modern empire would therefore possess an intellectual infrastructure unlike any other. Its universities would be centuries old, evolving continuously without interruption, fostering inquiry not through rebellion against authority, but as a natural extension of it. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolutions that occurred sporadically in our real world would, in this alternate history, have unfolded gradually within the imperial framework. By the 21st century, the empire would stand as a society deeply rooted in education and cultural refinement, where science and art were not opposites but partners in human progress. The social structure of this empire would reflect both its ancient origins and its modern sensibilities. The feudal hierarchy of the Middle Ages would have long since dissolved, replaced by a meritocratic system built upon education and service. The noble houses might still exist, but their role would be ceremonial rather than political. Real influence would belong to scholars, administrators, innovators, and artists who advanced the imperial vision. The imperial government would likely fund universal education and cultural programs, ensuring that every citizen participated in the shared legacy of knowledge and art. Social equality would not be the result of sudden revolutions, but of centuries of enlightened reform guided by a philosophy that saw justice and reason as inseparable. Religion, too, would have evolved differently. The reconciliation between empire and church that never occurred in reality would have found resolution centuries earlier. The papacy, stripped of temporal power, would have become a spiritual partner to the empire rather than its rival. The relationship between faith and governance would be one of mutual respect, with religion serving moral guidance and the empire ensuring peace and order. The result would be a society where spiritual life remained rich and active, but free from political manipulation. The deep conflicts between church and state that shaped so much of modern history, the wars of religion, the secular revolutions, the ideological battles, would have been largely avoided. Faith in this world would coexist peacefully with science, art, and philosophy. Technologically, the Hohenstaufen Empire would likely lead the world. Its rulers, inheriting a tradition of curiosity and innovation, would have made scientific progress a pillar of state policy. Frederick II had studied nature, medicine, and astronomy with a rational mind rare in his age. His successors would have institutionalized that spirit of inquiry. The empire's research centers would have driven discoveries in physics, chemistry, and engineering long before such disciplines arose in our timeline. The Industrial Revolution might have begun within imperial workshops centuries before it appeared in Britain. The combination of imperial resources, educational investment, and long-term planning would have accelerated development exponentially. By the 21st century, the empire might possess technologies that in our real world still belong to imagination. Clean energy systems perfected through early scientific foresight, transportation networks connecting the entire continent, and medical advancements that extend human life far beyond current limits. In military terms, the Hohenstaufens' historical emphasis on leadership, discipline, and innovation would have translated into a formidable modern defense system. Yet this would not be an empire of conquest. Having achieved unity through endurance rather than expansion, its military philosophy would center on protection and deterrence. Its armed forces would combine technological sophistication with strategic restraint, mirroring the balance of strength and intellect that characterized its earliest rulers. Cyber defense, space technology, and intelligence systems would form the backbone of its security. The empire would not need to impose itself through war. Its stability, wealth, and influence would make it a natural leader in global affairs. Its military presence, though immense, would be guided by the same principle that once led Frederick II to negotiate peace in the Holy Land rather than wage endless crusades. That true power lies in the preservation of harmony rather than the pursuit of destruction. Diplomatically, the empire's longevity would have made it the anchor of international stability. Its centuries of experience in balancing regional identities under a single system would allow it to act as mediator between nations. Instead of the European Union formed out of necessity after centuries of conflict, the world might look to the Hohenstaufen Empire as a model of integration. The Imperial Council, with representatives from its many provinces, could serve as a prototype for global cooperation. In this alternate world, the idea of international law and collective security might have originated from imperial institutions rather than from the aftermath of war. The United Nations, if it existed at all, might be a descendant of the empire's diplomatic system rather than a separate creation. The cultural influence of the empire would reach far beyond its borders. Its art, literature, and philosophy would shape global thought just as the Renaissance once did, but on a larger and more continuous scale. The imperial academies would produce thinkers whose impact could rival that of Aristotle or Newton, combining philosophy with practical invention. The Hohenstaufen belief in harmony between knowledge and governance would permeate every field of human endeavor. Architecture, music, and visual arts would carry the imprint of a civilization that valued proportion and meaning. Cities across the empire would become living museums of continuity, where history was preserved not as memory, but as active inspiration. The people of the empire would grow up surrounded by symbols of unity, imperial seals, shared festivals, and monuments that celebrated both past and future. Socially, this empire would embody a kind of ordered liberalism, a society that values freedom within the framework of law. The rights of individuals would be guaranteed, but always balanced against the responsibilities of citizenship. Civil debate, rather than rebellion, would shape public life. Political reform would occur through reasoned dialogue rather than revolution. The educational system, rooted in centuries of scholarship, would emphasize logic, ethics, and history, producing citizens capable of critical thought and moral judgment. In this sense, the empire would represent an ideal long sought by philosophers, a society where power is guided by wisdom and liberty by order. Economically, the empire's strength would come from integration. Its unified market, developed over centuries, would have created a continental economy unmatched in scale or efficiency. The industrial heartlands of Germany, the agricultural plains of Central Europe, and the maritime trade of Italy and the Mediterranean would all function within a single coordinated system. The stability of imperial governance would attract investment and innovation, while its legal traditions would ensure fairness and transparency. The empire's currency would likely serve as the world's standard, its trade networks spanning continents through both historical routes and modern technology. The spirit of rational organization that defined Frederick II's Sicilian reforms would manifest in global financial institutions modeled on imperial principles of accountability and order. Culturally, the people of this world would see themselves not as isolated citizens of separate nations, but as participants in a living continuum of history. Festivals, literature, and art would commemorate the great figures of the dynasty not as distant monarchs, but as founders of a shared civilization. The myth of Barbarossa sleeping beneath a mountain, waiting to return, would have taken on new meaning, not as a dream of revival, but as a metaphor for eternal vigilance and continuity. The empire's flag, bearing the ancient eagle that once symbolized imperial authority, would fly not as a mark of conquest, but as a sign of unity. In global politics, the Hohenstaufen Empire would occupy a position similar to a world superpower, yet defined by stability rather than dominance. Its relations with other great powers, perhaps an American republic, an Asian federation, or a revitalized African confederation, would be shaped by centuries of diplomatic experience. It would act not as an empire of expansion, but as a center of gravity around which global institutions evolved. Its influence would be moral as much as material, grounded in its ancient philosophy of balance between reason, faith, and justice. In this imagined 21st century, the Hohenstaufen legacy would be visible in every sphere of life. In the architecture that harmonized beauty with function, in the universities that carried on the pursuit of knowledge, in the justice system that valued fairness above privilege, and in the quiet pride of citizens who saw themselves as inheritors of 1,000 years of continuous civilization. The modern empire would not be a relic of feudalism, but the culmination of its transformation, a society that had mastered the art of preserving tradition while embracing progress. Yet even this imagined world would not be without tension. The same unity that gave the empire its strength would also test its flexibility in an age of rapid technological and social change. The digital revolution, artificial intelligence, and global migration would challenge the empire's ability to adapt its ancient structures to modern realities. But if the Hohenstaufen spirit endured, It would meet those challenges with the same rational curiosity and pragmatic wisdom that once guided Frederick II's court. Even in the age of satellites, global networks, and instant communication, the shadow of the Hohenstaufens still lingers across Europe. Though their empire vanished centuries ago, something about their story continues to call out from the past. A murmur beneath the stones of ruined castles, a whisper in the vaulted ceilings of ancient cathedrals, and a question that refuses to fade. How could a dynasty so brilliant, so capable, and so filled with vision have disappeared completely, leaving only echoes? The fascination they inspire today is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It is the recognition of something deeper, a reflection on human ambition, fragility, and the hunger for meaning that transcends time. Their allure lies first in the sheer drama of their existence. The Hohenstaufens embody every element that defines great history: power, intellect, courage, betrayal, and tragedy. They rose from the rugged heartlands of Swabia to claim the imperial throne of Europe, guided by an idea of order and unity that was centuries ahead of its time. Their rulers were warriors and thinkers, builders and dreamers, who sought to bind a fractured continent together through law and reason rather than fear alone. The image of Frederick Barbarossa marching across the Alps, or Frederick II negotiating peace in the Holy Land without drawing a sword, carries a timeless weight. These were not ordinary monarchs following custom. They were architects of destiny, shaping their world through will and imagination. Historians remain drawn to them because they capture a moment when Europe stood on the edge of transformation. In their story, one can see the fading of the old feudal order and the faint beginning of the modern age. They ruled at a time when the world's boundaries were expanding, not geographically but intellectually. Their courts were filled with scholars, poets, and philosophers. They encouraged inquiry when dogma still ruled thought. Their rule foreshadowed the Enlightenment long before the term existed. This blend of medieval power and modern curiosity makes them endlessly fascinating to those who study the crossroads of history. Alternative history enthusiasts are equally captivated, though for different reasons. For them, the Hohenstaufens represent the great what-if of European history. What if Frederick II's line had survived? What if the empire had remained whole? What if the church and the crown had reached harmony instead of hatred? Every twist in their story feels like a fork in the road that could have led to an entirely different world. The appeal lies not only in the grandeur of their past, but in the lost possibilities they symbolize. They stand as reminders that history is not inevitable. It is fragile, shaped by decisions, accidents, and fleeting moments that could easily have gone another way. Even for those with no interest in dynastic struggles, the physical remains of their empire exert a quiet power. Across Germany, Italy, and Sicily, the traces of their reign still command the imagination. Their castles rise like monuments to ambition, their stones weathered but enduring. One can stand before the ruins of Staufen Castle and imagine the beginnings of their journey, a family of Swabian lords gazing out over valleys they hoped to rule. In Italy, the ghost of their empire takes on a more refined form. Castel del Monte, built by Frederick II, stands as a masterpiece of geometry and symbolism, its octagonal shape reflecting a vision of order and balance that defied the chaos of the Middle Ages. Its design remains mysterious even today, a riddle in stone that scholars continue to interpret and reinterpret. Each surviving structure tells part of their story. The cathedrals of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, where Hohenstaufen emperors were crowned or buried, carry the weight of empire in their silent aisles. The grandeur of these places is not only architectural but emotional. To walk their length is to feel the presence of those who once believed that faith and power could coexist in harmony. In Palermo and other Sicilian cities, their legacy takes a more cosmopolitan form. The blend of Arab, Norman, and German influences in the architecture of that region mirrors Frederick II's own embrace of diversity and knowledge. He saw no contradiction between cultures, and his buildings reflect that unity, a vision centuries ahead of the divisions that later scarred Europe. The physical landscape of Europe bears their memory, not just through monuments, but through the geography of influence. Many towns and regions still trace their administrative or legal traditions back to systems established under Hohenstaufen rule. Roads built to link imperial centers became the arteries of commerce that shaped later economies. Even in places where their castles fell to ruin, the towns that grew around them continued to thrive, built on the foundations of imperial planning. The mark they left on law, architecture, and governance remains embedded in the daily life of Europe, often unnoticed but ever present. Their story also carries lessons that reach far beyond history books. The Hohenstaufens teach the peril of overreaching ambition, but also the power of vision. They remind us that even noble ideals can crumble when they clash with human pride and fear. Their fall was not simply the result of defeat in battle or political miscalculation. It was the collision between an idea of universal order and the stubborn realities of power. The popes who opposed them did so out of fear of losing control. The princes who betrayed them acted from self-interest. And the emperors themselves, though brilliant, could not escape the arrogance that sometimes comes with greatness. From their rise and fall, one learns that the most enduring achievements are those rooted in balance. Frederick II's brilliance lay in his ability to blend strength with intellect, but even he struggled to reconcile authority with freedom. His successors, caught between church and state, between north and south, between loyalty and rebellion, found that vision alone could not hold an empire together. It needed structure, compromise, and continuity, qualities that history often denies to those who reach too high. Their downfall also highlights the fragility of dynastic power. A single death, a single betrayal, or the loss of a battle could erase decades of progress. Yet while their bloodline vanished, their influence lived on, carried by the institutions they built and the myths they inspired. This is another reason they fascinate modern minds. They show how ideas can outlast empires. The concept of a unified Europe, governed by law and reason rather than mere force, was not born in the modern era. It was born in the dreams of emperors like Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, men who saw beyond the feuds of their age and imagined a civilization bound by shared purpose. In that sense, their failure was not total. The Europe that emerged after them, fragmented and war-torn, still carried their imprint. The later Holy Roman emperors, though weaker, continued to invoke their legacy as the golden age of imperial authority. Centuries later, during the rise of national movements, the memory of the Hohenstaufens became a symbol of unity and identity. German poets and historians in the 19th century spoke of Barbarossa as the sleeping emperor, resting beneath a mountain until his people were ready for him to return. The image captured the longing for national cohesion in a divided land. It was a myth, but one born of real memory, a cultural echo that kept their spirit alive long after their dynasty had faded into dust. Their endurance in legend also speaks to the human need for continuity. Every civilization, in its moments of uncertainty, looks backward to find models of greatness. The Hohenstaufens fill that role for Europe. They represent both the glory and the danger of empire, the beauty of ambition and the inevitability of loss. Their story reminds us that no achievement is permanent, yet nothing truly disappears. The ruins of their world still stand because what they built was not only material, it was intellectual, cultural, and spiritual. In the modern world, where power is often measured in technology and economy rather than lineage and blood, their example remains relevant. The Hohenstaufens showed that leadership requires more than conquest. It demands vision, wisdom, and the courage to bridge divides. Frederick II's willingness to negotiate with Muslim leaders instead of destroying them was a lesson in diplomacy that resonates even now. His insistence on law and order over arbitrary rule anticipated the modern idea of governance. His curiosity about science and nature reflected a belief that knowledge itself is a form of power. These qualities make him not only a figure of the past, but a model for the future. The fascination with their story is not limited to scholars or romantics. It extends into popular culture, where echoes of their legacy appear in novels, films, and games. The archetype of the enlightened ruler who must navigate the clash between tradition and progress owes much to Frederick II. The image of the lost emperor, waiting to return, continues to appear in literature and folklore. Even the architectural aesthetics they inspired, fortresses that combine symmetry with mystery, find modern reinterpretations in art and design. The Hohenstaufens, though long gone, still inspire the imagination of creators seeking to capture the balance between authority and idealism. Their lasting appeal also comes from the way their story encapsulates Europe's identity crisis. The tension between unity and diversity, between faith and reason, between order and freedom. They were the first to attempt what later generations would struggle with again and again: how to create harmony from difference. In that struggle, they failed, but their failure left a template for understanding what it means to build something larger than oneself. The modern European Union, with all its complexities, can trace the faint echo of its ideals back to the vision of a continent bound by shared law and mutual respect. The physical remains of their empire still draw visitors who sense this connection instinctively. Standing before Castel del Monte, one feels a quiet precision, a design that speaks of purpose beyond mere defense. The sunlight falling through its 8-sided towers seems to measure time itself, as if the building were a dialogue between earth and sky. In the cathedrals of Worms or Spire, the massive stone pillars rise like frozen prayers, holding centuries of memory within their walls. Even the ruins of lesser-known castles scattered across Swabia carry an unspoken dignity. These places are not relics. They are living reminders of what the Hohenstaufens achieved and what they lost. Their story teaches that legacy is not only what one builds, but what one leaves behind in the minds of others. The Hohenstaufens lost their empire, yet they became immortal in history because they represented an ideal. Every historian who studies them wrestles with the same paradox: how greatness can coexist with downfall, how progress can lead to destruction, and how beauty can emerge from tragedy. Their lives were marked by contradiction, but that very complexity is what makes them so human. There is also a personal dimension to their endurance in memory. The letters, charters, and chronicles that survive reveal not only emperors but individuals, people who loved, feared, doubted, and hoped. Frederick II's writings show a man who questioned dogma and sought understanding through observation. His laws reveal concern for justice and order. Even his conflicts with the church, though fierce, were not born of hatred but of conviction. To read about him is to see the struggle of a man caught between belief and reason, power and conscience. That struggle is timeless, and it mirrors the dilemmas faced by every age, including our own. The Hohenstaufen story is not one of simple nostalgia. It is a meditation on endurance. Their empire fell, but their ideals survived in forms they could never have imagined. Their vision of unity lives in every effort to build bridges between nations. Their respect for knowledge echoes in every institution that values learning, and their awareness of human limitation reminds us to temper ambition with humility. Their name, once a symbol of imperial authority, has become a symbol of aspiration. Today, as Europe continues to define its identity, the Hohenstaufen legacy serves as both inspiration and caution. Their rise shows the power of vision, while their fall warns of the danger of unchecked pride. Their architecture reminds us of the balance between strength and grace, their laws of the need for justice grounded in reason, and their myth of the sleeping emperor of the importance of hope even in decline. The lessons they offer are not confined to the past. They speak to every society that seeks to reconcile power with principle, unity with diversity, and ambition with restraint. The echoes of their world remain faint but persistent. They whisper through the forests of Swabia, across the plains of Sicily, and in the quiet chambers of cathedrals where light still falls on stone carved 8 centuries ago. To study them is to listen to those whispers, to hear the voice of an age that believed greatness could be achieved through intellect as much as through might. Their story invites reflection not on what was lost, but on what endures. The Hohenstaufens remind us that empires may die, but ideas do not. They endure in the human imagination, in art, in architecture, in the dream of unity that no defeat can extinguish. And so their legacy lives not as a monument to vanished power, but as a reminder of what it means to strive toward something larger than oneself. The lost emperors may have fallen, their line extinguished, their thrones empty. Yet their spirit still moves quietly beneath the surface of modern Europe, whispering that greatness is never truly lost, only transformed. In every effort to understand, to create, or to unite, the echoes of their empire can still be heard, an ancient voice reminding the living that history is never only past. It is a presence that waits, patient and eternal, for those willing to listen. To imagine the Hohenstaufens not as a memory, but as a presence is to cross the fragile border between history and imagination. For centuries their story has been confined to books, monuments, and the quiet admiration of historians, yet the question lingers in the modern mind. What if they were to return? What if one morning the news announced that a descendant of Frederick Barbarossa or Frederick II had emerged, claiming the heritage of the Holy Roman Empire and the right to restore what had been lost? It would not merely be a headline. It would be an event capable of shaking the foundations of identity, politics, and belief across the continent. The past would no longer be behind us. It would walk again, demanding recognition. The first reaction might be disbelief. Modern Europe, after all, is built on the ruins of monarchy and empire. Nations define themselves by their independence, by the very freedom from imperial control that the Hohenstaufens once sought to enforce. Yet disbelief would soon turn into fascination. People would remember the legends, Barbarossa sleeping beneath the mountain, waiting to rise when the land needed him most. For some, his return would seem almost prophetic, as if the struggles of the modern world had summoned an ancient answer. Economic uncertainty, cultural fragmentation, and political division might all feel, to those searching for meaning, like the signs that the empire's spirit was awakening. The old symbols would reappear on flags and screens. Conversations would shift from skepticism to possibility. Would one support such a revival? That question cuts deeper than politics. It touches the very heart of how one perceives power and legitimacy. To support a returning Hohenstaufen claim would mean believing that continuity matters, that the wisdom and unity of the past can guide a fractured present. It would mean trusting in the notion that empire, redefined for the modern age, could once again bind Europe together under law and shared purpose. The idea might appeal to those weary of bureaucratic stagnation and shallow nationalism. A Hohenstaufen revival could promise not conquest, but cohesion, a return to ideals of leadership grounded in justice and learning. But there would also be fear, and not without reason. The memory of empire is double-edged. For all its grandeur, it carries the weight of hierarchy and control. Many would resist a new dynasty on principle, arguing that history has already proven the dangers of concentrated power. The democratic world, shaped by centuries of struggle against kings and emperors, would not surrender easily to a crown, no matter how noble its lineage. Intellectuals and politicians would debate endlessly. Could an imperial figure exist within a democratic framework, perhaps as a unifying cultural symbol rather than a ruler? Could the name Hohenstaufen represent continuity without reviving domination? The reaction would likely divide societies, much as their ancestors once divided medieval Christendom. Some would see in them the promise of renewal, others the specter of regression. Yet beyond politics, the emotional impact of their return would be immense. The human fascination with lineage, myth, and the persistence of blood would come alive again. A living Hohenstaufen heir would not be merely a person, but a mirror reflecting the unending dialogue between past and present. The streets of their ancestral cities, Worms, Mainz, Palermo, Aachen, would fill with pilgrims and tourists alike. Historians would rush to authenticate documents, to trace genealogies, to separate myth from fact. Museums would curate exhibitions dedicated to their return. Artists, musicians, and writers would draw inspiration from the event, reimagining medieval grandeur in modern forms. If they did return, what kind of world would they find? It would be one far removed from the world their ancestors knew, yet strangely familiar in its struggles. The same forces that once tore the empire apart, religious tension, regional rivalry, economic inequality, still exist in subtler forms. But the tools of power have changed. Armies have given way to institutions, castles to parliaments, and proclamations to social networks. A modern Hohenstaufen ruler would have to understand that leadership now depends not on commanding armies, but on commanding narratives. Their strength would lie not in conquest, but in influence. A descendant claiming imperial heritage would be forced to adapt the ideals of their forebears to the realities of a globalized world. The original Hohenstaufens believed in order through law and knowledge. They saw governance as a balance between intellect and authority. In a modern context, those same principles could inspire a political and cultural movement focused on unity through education, environmental stewardship, and technological advancement. The empire they might seek to rebuild would not be territorial but conceptual, a federation of minds rather than of lands. It would promote dialogue across cultures, echoing Frederick II's court in Sicily, where scholars of different faiths and languages shared ideas freely. Supporting such a vision would mean believing that leadership can evolve without repeating its mistakes. It would require courage to imagine an empire not as an instrument of domination, but as a platform for progress. Resistance, on the other hand, would come from the fear that history cannot escape its cycles, that every empire, no matter how enlightened, eventually corrupts itself. Critics would warn that the return of any monarchy, however idealistic, risks undermining centuries of democratic development. They would argue that reverence for the past must never outweigh responsibility to the present. And yet, even in their opposition, They would be participating in the very dialogue that the Hohenstaufens once represented, the debate between unity and freedom, between vision and caution. The question then becomes personal. What would one feel standing before a modern Hohenstaufen emperor? Would all overcome skepticism? Would curiosity outweigh fear? It is easy to claim indifference when speaking hypothetically, but history has shown how quickly people gravitate towards symbols that promise meaning. In a world where politics often seems directionless, the image of a leader bound by tradition and intellect could be magnetic. The idea of continuity in a restless age could provide comfort. Yet for others, it would serve as a warning that humanity's longing for order can too easily become submission. If such a dynasty were to rise again, their challenge would be to translate heritage into relevance. A Hohenstaufen ruler could not simply wear a crown. They would have to justify it through deeds that align with modern values. They would need to embody integrity in an era of distrust, to promote knowledge in a time of misinformation, and to unify without suppressing difference. The real measure of their success would not be in reclaiming territory, but in reviving purpose. Their empire, if it could exist at all, would be one of ideas, an alliance of cultures and disciplines striving toward common progress. The emotional weight of such a revival would also affect art and culture profoundly. Just as the original Hohenstaufens inspired the architecture of cathedrals and the poetry of their courts, a modern return could spark a renaissance of creativity. Architects might seek to blend medieval symmetry with contemporary design, creating structures that symbolize the fusion of tradition and innovation. Artists could explore themes of rebirth, legacy, and memory, reimagining imperial motifs in digital and visual media. Musicians might revive the sounds of medieval Europe, merging them with modern genres to express the timeless rhythm of history. This cultural wave would not simply honor the past, it would reinterpret it, giving new life to the aesthetics of empire in a democratic age. On a social level, their reappearance could provoke reflection on identity. Modern Europeans often define themselves by nationality, yet the Hohenstaufen name transcends borders. It belongs to no single nation but to a shared heritage that connects Germany, Italy, and beyond. Their revival could reawaken the idea of Europe as a cultural unity rather than a political arrangement. It could challenge people to think of belonging not in terms of citizenship, but of civilization. Such an idea might resonate in a time when nationalism and fragmentation threaten cooperation. The Hohenstaufens could become symbols of continental identity, their return reminding people that Europe's strength has always come from the blending of its many voices. Of course, power attracts scrutiny. Any attempt to claim imperial status would face questions of legitimacy. Who decides whether an ancient lineage has the right to rule? Would they be elected, like the emperors of old, or simply inherit the claim? Modern law would likely resist hereditary privilege, yet public imagination often follows its own rules. A figure combining historical depth with modern sensibility could rise not by decree, but by influence. They might not need a throne at all. Instead, they could serve as a symbolic unifier, an ambassador of history, a living reminder that the ideals of justice, intellect, and unity are not confined to the past. In this sense, one might choose to support not their rule, but their role. Supporting them would mean valuing what they represent: the pursuit of wisdom, the integration of knowledge with power, the reconciliation of differences. Resisting them would mean fearing that symbolism could slide into authority, that reverence for legacy could turn into nostalgia for hierarchy. The line between inspiration and control is thin, and history warns that even the most enlightened rulers can cross it. Thus, the question is not only whether they deserve power, but whether humanity has learned enough to handle it wisely. A returning Hohenstaufen presence would inevitably influence global politics as well. In an interconnected world, no revival could exist in isolation. The United Nations, the European Union, and countless institutions would weigh the implications of an imperial restoration. Some nations might welcome the symbolism of unity, while others would see it as a threat to sovereignty. Yet even without formal power, the cultural influence of such a figure could be profound. They could act as mediators in conflicts, advocates for heritage preservation, and champions of scientific collaboration, reflecting the original dynasty's respect for learning and diplomacy. The very existence of a living link to medieval history could remind a fragmented world of its shared roots. For individuals, the return of such a dynasty would pose a simpler but more intimate question. What does legacy mean in one's own life? The Hohenstaufen story, after all, is not only about power, it is about endurance. They fell, but they were never forgotten. Their name survived through centuries because it spoke to the eternal human desire to leave something behind that time cannot erase. In their return, one might see a reflection of that same longing, the wish to connect with something larger and older than oneself. Whether one supports or resists them, the very act of imagining their return becomes a meditation on continuity, on how the past shapes the present and the present reshapes the past. A modern Hohenstaufen ruler, if they existed, would not command obedience by birthright. Their authority would come from embodying values that transcend politics, curiosity, justice, and balance. They would need to bridge ancient ideals with modern ethics, showing that the pursuit of knowledge and order can serve humanity rather than dominate it. Their success would depend on humility, the understanding that true leadership lies in service, not supremacy. If they managed that, their empire would not be a relic, but a model for a world seeking coherence amid complexity. In imagining such a return, one is not only speculating about politics or history. One is participating in a deeper reflection on the nature of civilization itself. Every era resurrects its heroes, reshaping them to fit its needs. The Hohenstaufens have survived in legend because they represent both aspiration and warning. They remind us of what humans can achieve when guided by intellect and vision, and what they can lose when blinded by pride. Their return, even as a thought experiment, forces one to confront those same truths in the modern context. Would humanity welcome the light of their wisdom, or repeat the darkness of their downfall? Perhaps the true return of the Hohenstaufens would not come through bloodlines, but through ideas. Every time people strive to build bridges between cultures, every time they defend knowledge against ignorance, every time they seek unity without tyranny, they bring back the essence of that lost empire. The name may stay buried in chronicles, but its spirit moves quietly in classrooms, in laboratories, in parliaments, and in the hearts of those who believe that greatness can coexist with grace. To support their return, then, is to support the idea that the past still has something to teach, a reminder that progress is not about forgetting, but about understanding what endures. So the question remains, how would you respond if the lost emperors returned? Would you stand beneath their banner, believing that an ancient vision could heal a divided world? Or would you resist, guarding the freedom that was bought with centuries of struggle? There is no right answer, only reflection. Perhaps the best way to honor their legacy is not by restoring their power, but by engaging with their memory, by continuing the dialogue they began between knowledge and authority, faith and reason, past and future. Their kingdom, if it ever rises again, will not be built of stone and sword. It will be built of thought, imagination, and the shared will to find meaning in history's long echo. And so, their story passes to us, the inheritors of their memory. Whether we choose to embrace or resist it, we cannot escape the question they leave behind. What do we owe to the past, and what does the past still ask of us?
The question is the center of experiment. The Ardens have already returned, not in body, but in the mind of those who read and imagine. Their empire lives wherever people talk and dream about unity and wisdom. Their throne is imagination, and their crown is curiosity. Their legacy still speaks to us. What would their return mean to you? Would you follow their vision of order and reason, or protect the freedoms of today? Your answer shows how you see both history and yourself. Their old empire was built from stone, the new one is made of ideas. In that way, their kingdom still lives, alive, curious, and endless.